Above all, Cyberpunk Edgerunners gets it. It understands, and that is truly not something I can say about virtually any media out there. I can't tell you how much I appreciate that. Above all, Cyberpunk Edgerunners realizes that, in the end, it's all pointless. There's two scenes, now actually, not even scenes, but two singular shots that will forever be burned into my retinas. How great a show must be to have two of those. Two moments when my entire world stops. Literally everything halts, and my brain is filled with nothing but a raw emotion. For a second, and then forever after, I am changed. I'm going to discuss these two shots in great detail, and I will also be discussing everything built around these two shots that make them so great. In essence, you could even say that these two images are the point of Cyberpunk Edgerunners. So I will certainly be attempting to pierce right into the pointless heart of this show. Like I did with Squid Game, although hopefully people actually decide to watch this one. Furthermore, before I truly dive into Cyberpunk, I will also be discussing other Trigger shows fairly extensively. I know you're here for Edgerunners, but trust me when I say that to fully get my point across, I have to use some of Trigger's other works, as well as Fat Thor. I need you to know just how much Trigger gets it, in order to show you just what exactly Trigger is getting. So please bear with me. Here's a timestamp if you really feel like skipping all of that though. Before I do that though, I warn you of obvious full series spoilers ahead. If you came here blind to the show and looking to see if it's actually worth checking out, which I'm sure many of you have, then just know I give it my full stamp of approval, because that means a lot. Studio Trigger was already the best thing in anime, and Edgerunners represents a monumental shift, a new era, in what even this animation juggernaut is able to emotionally portray. So please, watch the show. You won't regret it. Now, with that out of the way, let's get into this. There's a fairly common misconception that Kill La Kill is style over substance, or that while it's awesome in the way that its balls-to-the-wall action is never not entertaining, you won't really get much out of it. Kill La Kill has nothing to say, they say. It's about nothing. Now, this is an opinion I genuinely have never understood. If anything, I can't think of a single anime that is more about anything or something than Kill La Kill, even sometimes to its own detriment. And while you certainly don't have to appreciate or agree with what it's trying to say, or hell, even enjoy the anime at all, to say that the substance just isn't there is, to me at least, an egregious error on the part of the viewer. This is to the point where I won't even allow myself to get into it just because of how absolutely thematically dense, and even at times suffocating Kill La Kill is. There are plenty of videos, especially those from Studio, that talk much more extensively about the topic, and even some research papers done dissecting the Japanese-American cultural introspection at the heart of just one of the show's interpretations. So I seriously implore you to go check out that stuff for yourself. After this video, of course. But I say all this today not to talk about Kill La Kill specifically, but rather about Studio Trigger's greatest and also least appreciated attribute that carries almost all of its anime: the writing. Now, the actual definition of writing is kind of odd, but for this video's purposes, we'll be splitting it down into two easily digestible parts: the story structure and the dialogue. To analyze these two aspects of writing, I'm going to take a brief look at two other twin Trigger anime before bringing it back to Cyberpunk Edgerunners, since that is of course what this video is ultimately about. Don't worry, I didn't forget about that. Oh yeah, and full spoilers for the first show's ending up ahead, and some minor ones for the second, since I actually haven't even finished yet. And here I am talking about it. SSSS.Gridman is, upon first watch, a 7 out of 10, at least in my opinion. With rather dull characters and an only semi-interesting plot, it held my attention just enough to get me to finish the show, but also not care so much about the ending that my crippling OCD won't let me finish watching until the end because I want to wait for the perfect moment to watch it, one that sadly never comes. SSSS.Gridman is, upon a second watch, a 9 out of 10, at least in my opinion. This is because, in retrospect, the story only ever had one character, Akane. The entire world of Gridman, at least what we see, is more or less an escapist fantasy she envisioned, based on her favorite tokusatsu films and TV shows. Her mind creates the world, but also seeks to destroy it, then rebuild and destroy, then rebuild and destroy over and over and over and over. It's fascinating. Once I discovered this fact in the finale, I almost instantly considered her amongst the best written villains of all time. And it was insane to me that the only actual character in the show wasn't even the protagonist. And then something happened. In the last sequence of the show, everything gets stripped away. The plot, the fictional characters, hell, even the animation. It's gone. And what we were left with was probably the entire point. A girl, alone, getting out of bed, with the sun gently streaming through the blinds she's kept closed for so long. Finally, she's waking up. And then it ends with this last image, with the title card very intentionally placed right over it. This is SSSS.Gridman. Again, we've already stripped everything else away, and we finally just see the point. In the end, perhaps that's what a story needs to be told for. What Akane had to find in her endless dream and through the plot of the actual anime itself. Seeing the point. I won't say this is the proper way to write a story. There is none. I certainly won't claim that it's the most entertaining way. I'd actually argue that it almost threw away entertainment value in order to reach this point. If the characters were ever too engrossing, then the dream would be too real, and we would never want to leave. We would miss the point. However, I will say without any doubt in my mind that this story, this point, was a memorable one. I will watch more entertaining stories, more engrossing stories, more technically brilliant stories. Hell, even stories I love a lot more. But when I think about those few moments in art that have stood my test of time, that have stopped and shook my entire world, SSSS.Gridman has a spot in that select few. And I think that at the very least means something special. I got the point, but only because Trigger did first. Our second show on the list, SSSS.Dynazenon, is actually much better than Gridman. I'd rate it a 9 out of 10 and consider it one of the top 3 best anime of 2021. I also haven't finished it due to that dilemma mentioned earlier. But what I can say about it, why I love it so much, is the dialogue is simply next level. This is for 2 reasons, the first of which requires me to briefly mention the thing that made the MCU dead to me. Fat Thor. Fat Thor is Marvel, and that it represents that the MCU just doesn't get it. When a character experiences unimaginable trauma and resorts to overeating and, most importantly here, alcoholism, you have to take that seriously. You can't, say, have the character's entire motivation for joining back into the fight be based on a joke about said alcoholism. Not in this kind of film, anyway. The writers didn't understand the gravity of the situation, and I promise you that understanding is so vitally important, yet something I literally never see. Although usually not as egregious as this. Now, I see 2 counter-arguments to this, the first being that his reasoning is more nuanced than a cheap joke about getting some beer and, okay, fine. But where is this nuance? Certainly not in Thor Love and Thunder, a story that gave up on having a story. And yeah, there's a better character building in Endgame, yes, I won't deny that, but it's the fact that such a shallow and haha funny moment was made in the first place that shows such little respect for this character. And importantly, with no proper meta justification for the humor after the fact. You can make a joke like that in BoJack Horseman because the show is hyper introspective and even comments on such humor. Endgame does not. BoJack gets it. The second counter-argument is that it's a film made primarily for teenagers, and, well, you can't tout a kids show like Avatar as being one of the best written pieces of television out there with a nuanced and serious take on genocide and colonization, and in the same breath say stuff for kids isn't to be taken seriously. Alright, I ranted about Endgame too long, that wasn't the point. When SSSS.Dynazenon talks about something like suicide, it takes a moment to pause. It understands fully that it's talking about suicide. It takes it seriously. And it executes brilliantly, offering up several moments that have earnest discussions on several such topics, without, and this is vital, feeling the need to fill the dead space in the dialogue with anything. It has a singular focus with no room for bullshit, because it understands the gravity of it all. Again, I don't think taking subject matter seriously has to always result in a serious product. It really just depends on the media in question. I brought up BoJack because it's a show that makes jokes about heavy topics all the time, and I don't see it as any less valuable than any of the hard-hitting scenes in SSSS.Dynazenon. In fact, I think BoJack is way better. The distinction is that both shows understand. The gravity of the situation is never lost on them, and me as a viewer, I can just so easily pick up on that. Sadly, this is a rare moment. It's actually kind of difficult to describe how exactly we pick up on such things, but I'll just trust you'll also understand when a show understands. Secondly, Studio Trigger dialogue specifically is so goddamn amazing because it also understands the vibe, which is reflected beautifully through the voice acting. 𝐏𝐨𝐬𝐧𝐭𝐥𝐞𝐬𝐬 is completely action-packed, so the dialogue is loud and explosive and often grandiose, especially for Satsuki. Darling in the Franxx is a moody teenage drama, and the pilots talk like, well, moody teenagers in the midst of some drama. But SSSS.Dynazenon is the best example of this concept, and is honestly what initially blew me away. The characters are quiet, soft-spoken even. They kind of just talk like real Japanese people. And that is something I've quite literally never seen in anime, like not even once. I love the usual work of 𝐏𝐨𝐢𝐬, but sometimes when the vibe fits it, I just need some people talking in such a way where the nuance is incredibly translated to the soft-spoken words. Of course, great voice acting can only go so far as the quality of the script, but while I don't think I have to waste any more time saying that I obviously find basically every Trigger anime to have some of the most emotionally resonant, but also thematically dense dialogue in the biz. Ranging from Kill La Kill to Little Witch Academia, Trigger does the impossible task of building fleshed out, believable character dramas, while centering around world-class plots that are actually about something. If you've watched my Arcane video, which you definitely should, you know how difficult I think it is to pull this off. And now that we know how much Trigger just gets it, let's take an extensive look at exactly what it is that they understand. Pointlessness. Cyberpunk is a genre mainly defined by a sense of pointlessness, primarily in the face of capitalistic interest in an advancing sense of technology. Technology that often continues to create an ever-increasing gap between the rich and the poor, while also enticing the latter into a world of hyper-controlled non-reality. For us, this is essentially all the metaverse is really trying to accomplish and what your phone is doing to you right now, giving you a sense of partial consciousness transplantation, as I call it, which for an actual explanation, you're just going to have to watch this video here, after this one is over, of course. For those in the world of Cyberpunk 2077 and Edgerunners, this comes primarily in the form of cybernetic enhancements, or chrome. This stuff is everywhere within the setting. This, in the case of our main cast, leads them into a world of crime, another mainstay of capitalistic cultures. To best analyze this, let's look at episode 6 and primarily at Maine. The opening scene of him running in the desert is probably a perfect representation of his hopelessness. He lives in a city that constantly talks about dreams, in a society that constantly pumps into his brain the endless possibilities that even someone like him can achieve. Something like brain dance isn't dissimilar to our social media, in that it makes us seek joy in the lives of others in a non-reality. This dichotomy then, as it always seems to do, makes us yearn for power in our personal lives, so that we may have the freedom to pursue the dreams that we want, the dreams that we see, the dreams that others are clearly achieving. Why not us then? If this really is the city of dreams, then why am I so unhappy? Of course, Maine is running through an empty desert with seemingly no end in sight. There are no answers here. As the radio broadcaster talks about traffic, about a difference between regular people and those others. Perhaps Maine, having seemingly been brought up impoverished, sees himself in the latter. Perhaps even he feels disgusted with himself for something that he has no control over. He wants that control. And as he stands before a line in the road, a distinct separation between the dirty, worn-down sand and a new side of pure, unsoiled sand, he thinks about dreams. He thinks about being on that other side and how he might be able to get there. And just then, he hears the lines that may be able to lead him there. Never fear the risk. You'll never make it big dreaming quiet, dreaming small. And as I looked at Maine's face, drawn with such hyper-realistic detail and unique lighting effects that I knew this was a big moment, I saw in him a decision. To become a Night City legend. To dream big. To try and cross that line. It always did confuse me a bit why Maine and then David wouldn't just cut down on the chrome. I mean, they surely realized they were going to die or go cyber psycho, yet they just kept going. Why? Sure, if they cut down on the cybernetics, then they would be far less effective cyberpunks, but does that benefit really outweigh their own lives? Well, I think that answer for Maine, and we'll be talking about David more in a bit, lies entirely in this opening scene. A major theme of the anime is that life truly is about more than dreams. That the most important thing is living with those you love. The tragedy of the story then is that seemingly nobody gets that. For them, and Maine especially, that grandiose dream is everything. And honestly, as frustrating as it is from an outsider's perspective, are we really that much different? Grind in your 20s, build in your 30s, live in your 40s. I've heard that phrase passed around from every faux millionaire Instagram page for years now. And while it's so incredibly on the nose that almost everybody's gonna make fun of it, we all live in a fairly similar lifestyle, usually without even realizing it. We all have our dreams, some of which are drip-fed to us from an early age. Hearing stories about men like Rockefeller being told we can rise up the ranks with our own merit. Even I, someone who believes the situation is much more nuanced than that and honestly kinda hopeless, I'm still making this video. To be honest, I don't even feel like writing this script right now. I'd rather go get an egg and cheese than an everything bagel, but instead I'm putting the time aside to grind this out. While working on my film, I sacrificed a ton of time that I could have spent hanging out with friends, or actually finishing ReZero Season 2, but I didn't. Because I have a dream that I've been told I can accomplish, despite everything. Some of us even work ourselves into the ground, not even enjoying life at all for years, sometimes whole decades, just to chase that dream. While certainly not as dramatic as something like cyberpsychosis, we all do this in some form or another. Now, let's look at heavily impoverished neighborhoods. Part of the reason crime rates are so high is this pursuit of wealth without any of the viable means to achieve it. Even David, who was receiving a proper education, was shunned and ostracized, made to feel like he didn't belong there. He probably did think that, honestly. While I'm certainly not justifying crime and violence, it's obviously the wrong thing to do. People have a natural tendency to want power, control, and the reason for both of those things, freedom. I talked about this extensively in my Arcane video, but this is also a huge reason why drugs are such an issue in these neighborhoods. People are hopeless, yet still hopeful. They are without means, yet still dream. Drugs and violence can serve as both escapism from this situation, but seemingly the only viable way that people see to escape from those limited means, to rise up. Well, then in sports, which is a whole different beast that much more qualified people have already discussed in other videos. Links in the description. Living in a capitalistic society almost always means these people won't get the help they need, especially when the education system is broken and relies on something like property tax, which poor neighborhoods obviously won't have a lot of, which makes for a bad education system and leads to little job opportunities, which leads to low local property taxes, which leads to, okay, yep, this got me ranting. In the world of Cyberpunk, this issue is especially egregious, which leads to the extremely high crime rates. If even well-off people already sacrifice part of their lives to pursue dreams, then you can only imagine what people with little to no financial options will do. For those like Maine and David, the dream quite literally outweighs the value they put on their lives. And that's a point we'll be driving home in the next section. As Maine says specifically to David, keep running. Even if it's the end for him, this dream, this abstract, probably pointless dream, can live on through David. I'm honestly not sure if it's freedom or money or overthrowing the elite or just violence. I don't think even the characters know. Honestly, I think it all just ends up being the same anyway. Perhaps it's just something we believe in to keep us sane in this insane world. But for me, Maine's face here and then here says it all. Cyberpunk Edgerunners understands this confusion. It just simply gets the weight of this emotional turmoil. And I'm sure of this because of the immaculate shot composition for these faces. I can't even explain fully what makes them so great, but the static look mixed with the hyper-realistic facial features just makes everything freeze. It's one of those world-ending moments for me. It just stands out so drastically from the aesthetics of the rest of the show, as if all the immense weight is bearing down all at a singular tragic, yet almost beautifully ethereal moment. The dream and the pointlessness of it all is captured in a single shot. For Maine specifically, we see the start of the journey and then the bitter end. I know that Trigger understands this. I just do. Now take everything I just said and crank that up to 1,000,000, baby. As Lucy and David silently drive in the thruway, reflecting on everything that just happened, the sun rises up. Perhaps the beginning of a new journey. And then we see David's face, the static look with movement limited to the eyes. And we see all we need to. The trauma of this moment, all crashing into David's mind at once. The violence, the bloodshed, the cyberpsychosis. The literally perfect shot composition portrays all of this in a way that I have never seen before in my life. We are left to question what the entire point of all of this was. Perhaps David is too. And as a singular drop of water streams down his face with all the fluidity in the world, he remains completely still. Perhaps symbolizing that through all this confusion, he will remain steadfast in the Edgerunner pursuit of this dream. He will be moved emotionally, of course, but his life will not. He is endlessly stuck in this moment, this dream, all while life flows down him. Trigger understands the weight of this. David is special. With his inhuman tolerance towards cybernetics, perhaps he is destined to be someone truly great. And until the bitter end, David holds on to this, it being the only real difference maker between himself and a life of complete worthlessness in the eyes of society. David is also not special. In the eyes of the corporate world, he is a valuable test rat, yes, but there will always be more. If he doesn't pan out, then that just means the company has to be a bit more patient, with all of the violence he inevitably causes being an acceptable margin in order to properly run these tests. This dichotomy is a major defining feature of David's story arc, something I feel as if it's really time to fully talk about, as it encapsulates the entire point of Cyberpunk Edgerunners. Since the very beginning of the story, and I'm assuming at the beginning of his life, David was always both told and shown, more importantly, that his life had little, if any, value. Even aside from being a smart enough kid to recognize the hopelessness that permeated his entire neighborhood and see how the capitalist system of the city exploits him and his people, we can see times where David is explicitly shown that his very life doesn't matter. The most obvious is in school, where the other kids at best ignore his existence, but at worst actively bemoan it, or even devalue him through bullying. And yeah, David is a rough and tough kid who don't take no shit from nobody, sure, but that is very clearly a facade. We can see just enough emotional vulnerability from him and, more importantly, can naturally infer based on his actions that he has taken what they all say to heart. He proves time and time again that he truly holds very little regard for his own life and success. This is not just shown from his borderline suicidal mad dash towards legendary cyberpunk status, but even in little things like hardly hesitating to throw away his education to get back at the kid who beat him up. Now, he didn't really have much of an option to stay at the school at the time, so throwaway may be the wrong word here. But it's important to note that when even given an opportunity at a full ride, long before he knew the full reasoning behind that decision was to be an Arasaka lab rat, he still says no. Not only that, but he didn't really even acknowledge the offer much at all, honestly. I think the final straw in terms of his own view on his value was the death of his mother, though. Her death isn't some emotional outburst. Rather, it's quiet. Disconnected, even. David saw with his own two eyes a medical team pass them up, leave them to die, just because of the insurance they had. And then the hospital only stabilized her condition, opting to not fully treat her life since they know David can't afford that anyway. But hey, at least he got a good deal on a cremation package. I can't envision a single person, let alone a kid, experiencing something like that, and presumably experiencing much of the same every day, and not having little to no value for his own life. That's just the kind of shit you end up internalizing 99.9% of the time, even if you don't realize it. And even if you think you're the exact opposite, you're not. So it's really no wonder why David does what he does, and I'm sure this applies to the rest of the crew as well. Maine is definitely included in this. This is when David has a choice, a very important choice. He can die, or he can die. Now let's give him some time to think about this one. The life of an Edgerunner is one filled with death. I mean, they don't have the saying, you're not remembered for how you live, but for how you die, for nothing. As if David didn't already have zero concern for his life to begin with. If you don't die in a fight, you will almost certainly succumb to cyberpsychosis, which of course will result in your death anyway. This obviously seems like the wrong choice, but even when taking out all the psychological aspects that go into choosing that path, which we'll get to, we're still left with a hopeless situation. David is actually kind of lucky here, since no normal kid would have gotten that full ride scholarship, instead just being left to the streets to probably die in some random shootout like his mom. He's lucky until you consider what the process of test running the cyberskeleton would ultimately do to him. Simply put, being that guinea pig would have given him cyberpsychosis like 20 times faster, resulting in, of course, his death. So while he didn't really know this reality at the time he actually made the choice, he honestly probably did make the right decision here. Well, as right as a decision can be when it involves killing countless people. And yet, despite the choices he made, he still ended up in that cyberskeleton anyway, because often there are external factors that go beyond our control. Faraday's power-hungry attitude just can't be accounted for in David's plans. Yes, David always could have just walked away, and the show is clearly trying to tell us that he should have, but to call him stupid for not doing so would be missing the point. Those external factors beyond our control, they're what shape us. In a way, we kind of are those factors. Even Faraday, who serves as the final external wrench in David's life and ultimately his doom, is himself a man completely influenced by the external factors around him that are beyond his control. Edgerunners goes out of its way to show how different he is from the actual corpos. How his desperate scramble for wealth and power is compared to the relaxed, honestly indifferent attitude of the corpos who are actually in power. They see Faraday as nothing more than a dog, just as Faraday sees David. If he had been born into different circumstances, his entire attitude here would be completely different. He also wouldn't even be Faraday. In this way, Faraday himself is kind of this desperate scramble. So again, we have to apply the same logic to David. He does have a choice, yes, but any choice he does make almost completely hinges on everything in his life that came before. The dreams of his mom in Maine, his disregard for his own life, his anatomy that makes him able to handle cyberware at a high level, his love for Lucy, and most importantly, the place he was born, Night City. There are no happy endings here because there were never any happy beginnings. To me, that is the biggest tragedy of Edgerunners. Seeing David at the top of Arasaka Tower, shifting in and out of full-blown cyberpsychosis, smiling and exclaiming to his mom that he finally made it there, to the very top of Arasaka. He never needed a dream, he just needed a path. This climb up the corporate ladder had been repeated to him over and over by his mother, to the point where it was ingrained into his very soul. He just never realized it until these final moments, if he ever really did. But this is Night City, and he's a slum kid. The system never had a way for someone like him to make it to the top of that tower from the inside. No, perhaps this was the only way. Perhaps this was the only way he would ever be able to climb this tower, predetermined by his mother's one and dying wish since the day he was born, from the outside. It's a beautifully tragic moment, but then a question remains, one that is perhaps even more tragic. What was the point? There's a small sequence during this scene we've been discussing that I think brings home what Edgerunners is trying to tell us, or rather the emotions it's trying to convey. As David laughs rather maniacally, staring up at the sky, he suddenly stops, and what he sees there, I didn't realize until I rewatched other parts of the show that the absolute weight of this moment bore down on me. Lucy and David serve as the emotional core of the entire anime. And when David looks up and sees the beautiful light streaming by his eyes, this is a direct callback to much earlier in the show, when Lucy breaks David out of the ambulance. Back then, he looked up at her, this seemingly crazy girl he barely knew, and as he took in this sight, with the light streaming past his eyes, in that moment, I believe he fell in love. A beautiful, innocent moment, where time stopped, and all the other bullshit in the city ceased, even if just for a split second. To me, that is when David was truly alive. Then we mirror this scene with the one to the last episode, when we see those same lights in David's eyes, but now that shit has finally disrupted the moment. He is literally hooked up to a death machine in and out of cyberpsychosis. There is no coming back from this. This juxtaposition, to me, which is only further driven home, with the scene of Lucy getting David back under control mirroring their first kiss, spells out the emotion that Cyberpunk Edgerunners is trying to convey. Pointless tragedy. Dreams are, well, they're a bit complicated. I mean, what is a dream but an extension of reality that is perpetually, by definition of the word dream, out of our reach? On the surface, Lucy's dream is to go to the moon, but it was never actually about that, which I think is fairly obvious to the audience. Rather, it's much more abstract. Lucy wants to escape Night City, itself a material symbol for the oppression and restriction she feels, which in her case is especially bad because of her upbringing, if you can even really call it that. In this case, of course, Night City is also a literal place she does want to escape from. The moon, meanwhile, has always historically been emblematic of freedom, so it would make sense why Lucy's dream would be to go there. And while she probably does want to literally go there as well, the real dream is most certainly to just be free of the oppression she has always experienced. True freedom. That is what Lucy actually wants. One of the most tragic aspects of Cyberpunk Edgerunners, then, is that David never once realizes this. A huge motivation behind his dangerous criminal activity, honestly maybe even the largest surface reason for it, is to save up enough money to pay for them, but more especially Lucy, to take a trip to the moon. And in that pursuit, he loses his life, without ever realizing that he had become part of her new dream. He was, in a way, her freedom. Because, as we've discussed, the most devastating parts of oppression are internal. Believing that your life has no value, pursuing goals unconsciously forced upon you by others, whole groups of people putting themselves down for committing crime and violent acts, even though it was the grander system that instilled this into them to begin with. It's much more nuanced than that. Not to sound like a cliche here, but you can leave Night City, but Night City won't leave you. Not so easily. Self-eternalized oppression, obviously caused by external oppression, is much, much harder to rid yourself of, especially when a lot of it is thought to be the result of intergenerational trauma in many respected groups of thought. David to Lucy was part of this potential solution. He was her light, maybe even her life, and she ultimately lost that, because he was pursuing a dream that he thought she wanted, but never actually did. It all just seems kind of pointless, doesn't it? This sentiment is directly echoed a few times within the series. Doc explicitly states this when he says, "Go be a legend," or whatever you punks do. The way he delivers this line, with resignation and a knowingness that David just isn't coming back, made me feel like I had already watched this series hundreds of times. That I have seen this same scene play out more times than I can count. And I can't fully describe to you how abysmally depressing that is. Within this light, with Doc's words here, this entire thing, when pulled back and analyzed on both a macro and micro level, it just seems absolutely pointless. So then, what does David have? In this messed up world, what can he possibly hold on to make himself stay sane? He's special. He believes himself to be special. He has to believe himself to be special. When faced with an unsurmountable task, you have two options: run away from it or run at it blindly. Maine symbolizes the latter, but he was never fast enough. David, however, is. He charges right in, but the only way one can do so for so long is to believe themselves to be an enigma, a special case. Everyone else failed, sure, but I'm different. I'll be not even just the rare, but that 1 in a billion example of doing things right. Because me, I'm special. I can't blame David for thinking this, because honestly, what other hope can he possibly have? Without a dream of his own, what other direction but blindly forward can he go? I think this is why when Tanaka brings up what David actually wants out of life, he pauses. Like, he really hesitates here. Because as weird as it sounds, he's never even thought of that. He's never had to think about it. His life has just been a series of coasting on other people's waves, like his mother's dream or Maine's mad dash. He probably subconsciously doesn't even believe himself to be worthy of such grandiose desires like happiness or love. He has no value after all. So when he's finally, for the first time, questioned about it, it makes him shut down. And when he doesn't come up with an answer, all he has left is to double down, that he's special, and even Arasaka thinks so. Perhaps this struggle for self-meaning and value wouldn't be so bad if it weren't for the violence that David ends up afflicting. After all, he is a criminal, but the way in which he sees this is honestly quite fascinating. He views his life to be almost a war between the cyberpunks versus the corpos and police officials. It's not even just his own life that doesn't seem to have value to him, but rather this extends to these other groups, at least when we see him right after the time skip. It's as if he has developed such a narrow worldview and can't even imagine life outside of this war anymore. I mean, he's clearly pretty okay with killing what is likely hundreds of people, but it's when he kills the secretary that this entire worldview comes crashing down. He realizes that he's become the exact same thing as what killed his mother. A violent trendsetter that not only kills others, but inspires other kids to do so. And in the process, even gets those kids killed indirectly. All he's really done here is continue the cycle that got him started on his own path, perpetuating a system that does very little but sadly act as corpo dogs, as the series drives home again and again. This is why the office woman's death hits him like a freight train, as he realizes all of this, and even looks back at all the other deaths he's caused. He had grown numb to it, he says. He stopped seeing people as people in this ongoing war. And again, I have to ask, what is the point here?
I couldn't wait for you to come and clear the cover.
I just got done watching the I Really Want to Stay at Your House music video on the Cyberpunk 2077 YouTube channel as inspiration to get over the hump and finally finish this script. This, well, I'm not sure if this was a good idea. As I watched David and Lucy, all of their scenes together with the energetic yet melancholic song playing behind them, I just felt so much love. It was pouring out. And damn it, now I'm depressed. Because David truly didn't have to die. And yet to be David Martinez is to die in this way. And that is just abysmally depressing, to be honest. Especially when the love was so beautiful. Is so beautiful. I want to talk about the ending. Well, I don't want to talk about the ending because I don't want to get even more depressed, but I feel like I have to. Because as long as Lucy gets to the moon, which she does, then everything is fine, right? This was all done for something, right? Well, no. It was pointless. Now, this is certainly left up to personal interpretation. I've seen many say this ending was a happy and hopeful one, but I've also seen people believe David isn't actually dead because there is no body shown, and, well, I think some people missed the point. I also think maybe I did too. I certainly hope I did. I want Lucy to be happy, damn it, but I just don't think she is. To be as blunt as possible, the trip to the moon is one of the most commercialized sequences I have ever seen. Seriously. I am honestly shocked there wasn't a McDonald's on the shuttle there. And keep in mind, this is all happening after David directly states that he is throwing his life away because he has nothing left, but that Lucy still has a dream. This dream, this trip, is quite literally what he sacrificed his life for. Well, at least as far as he believes. To him, nothing else matters. And then we have this. Ads plastered everywhere. The same subliminal messaging that kills cyberpunks. The first place winner of the world's most oppressed looking face. An overhead speaker that is most definitely a robot, and most definitely has said all of this hundreds, maybe even thousands of times. More random tourists standing around like goddamn Times Square. I mean, they aren't even going out into the moon, they're just jumping around a crater. And then Lucy. Alone. If you were going to tell me you sat down with your unsalted butter popcorn like a heathen and watched this sequence and saw anything but the single most commercialized scene in the entire show, well, then you're probably a happier person than me. Congratulations. But I just can't get anything else out of it, and it seems Lucy can't either. Here she is on the actual moon, her apparent dream, and yet all she can see and think about is her brain dance with David. A simulation. To her, this is preferable because both aren't real. The brain dance isn't, obviously, but this moon trip, this isn't her real dream. David was. Which is why she would prefer a simulation over this hunk of rock. Because he was there. He was alive. Damn it, he was alive. And now, he's not. The only single time she smiles in this entire scene is when she sees him. When he disappears, she looks as if she's about to cry. And as she looks up with a weak grin on her face, we see her true feelings under her eyes. Worn out. Tired. Probably from crying. And then we get the best shot in the entire show. One even better than David's face in episode 6. One that answers the question that the former posed. With all this violence and bloodshed, oppression and manipulation, what's the point? This is Trigger's best example of its infamous plot device of going to space, because it asks what that ascension even means. We've made it to the moon, yet are unhappier than we were before. So why? I'm going to keep asking over and over again what the point of all of this was. All of this bullshit was. Nothing. There is no point. There are only reasons. David had no value for his own life because he was constantly told he didn't have any. Any dream he could have had would be pointless anyway. Gloria was never going to have her son accepted into higher society in a way that would have retained his identity. Maine was never going to cross that line in the desert because all he was ever fighting for was the profit of other megacorporations, constantly changing signs depending on the job. Every single cyberpunk could become a legend, but it would never amount to anything. They're dead. It doesn't matter anymore. He lives for these dreams, these worthless dreams, but never actually had his own. But that's wrong. He says outright that getting Lucy to the moon was his dream. He would get her there no matter what. So, David, what did it amount to? She made it, she's here, but it was a worthless trip. Just another way to spend money in a society that values it over human lives. David, what was the point? There needs to be a point, right? Lucy wants true freedom. And yet her identity, who Lucy is tied to her own self-oppression, caused by external oppression in such a way that to change that would be to be a different person. Perhaps that's okay, but then that isn't your dream. It's ultimately somebody else's, someone who doesn't exist, a possibility. A dream is an extension of reality that, by definition, is inherently not within reach. If it was, it would be a goal. But Night City isn't the place of goals. It's the city of dreams. This is what killed David, because he remained David Martinez up until the bitter end. I don't want to make it sound like it's impossible for personal liberation. This is just a show after all. But that answer, that point, is not something I can imagine, at least not right now. So I'm not sure if it's truly possible or not. And that reality, well, it's honestly pretty soul-crushing to think about. But I think that the key to happiness, at least, is just having someone else around. It's as simple as that. This is all something that Trigger understands, I can tell. That last shot, to me at least, is saying all of this, bringing everything into question. What is Lucy staring up at? If the moon wasn't enough, then what about the sun? If the moon represents freedom, then what does the sun represent? Love? David? Or is it the ultimate proclamation of abstraction? Something you can stare at all day long and never understand? Does the answer lie there? As the sun rays beam down on her, I think of 𝐏𝐨𝐬𝐧𝐭𝐥𝐞𝐬𝐬. I think of heaven and its promise of eternal freedom and happiness despite circumstance. I think of an endless paradise where David and Maine are hanging out and everyone is still happy. They're alive there. Maybe this is Lucy giving up on a dream as she opens her arms wide and accepts the reality that the only time she will ever be happy and free is when she's dead. If such a mythical paradise even exists in the first place. Perhaps the answers only lie in such a fantasy, an easy all-of-the-above multiple choice option. I don't know. I really don't know. But what I do know is that this series, to its absolute core, is cyberpunk. What that means is that the series was never hopeless, because to me, hopelessness means the answer, or the goal, is out of your reach, unattainable because of outside circumstances. It's there, it's visible, but it's just an impossible reach. No, Cyberpunk Edgerunners isn't hopeless. It's worse, honestly, because the answer isn't there. It never was. The show doesn't even have some theme or message to share, but rather just a singular emotion that, in the end, it was all just fucking pointless anyway.
Lucy.
Oh, David.
And, as always, thank you for watching.